Welcome to Vanished Vail, where we take you to many of Vail's very special places. I'm really happy today to introduce you to Jeff Babson. He is a naturalist, he's a longtime Vail resident, and he is the founder and owner of Sky Island Tours. Now, Jeff is also a wildlife viewing specialist for Pima County Natural Resources, Parks, and Recreation. Welcome to Vanished Vail, Jeff.
Thank you, JJ. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this is October 2020, and we thought the month of Halloween would be perfect to explore the role of bats in the ecosystem around Vail. So, Jeff, would you share a little bit with us about some of the special places around Vail that you've seen bats?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it is very appropriate to talk about bats during the spooky season in October. Arizona is home to 28 different species of bat, which is the second highest in the country. Texas has us beat by one, and it's a much bigger state, so we do really well, and almost every one of them lives in southern Arizona in our area. So some of them, like the canyon bat, which used to be called the western pipistrelle, is a little tiny guy. It's only got a wingspan of about 6 or 7 inches, and they'll come out even before sunset. You might see them flying around your patio if you're sitting out in the shade on a warm summer evening. They might fly out really early. They look like butterflies or moths flying around. You could have pallid bats. Pallid bats are a little bit bigger. We're going to talk more about them later. They come out a little bit later in the evening. You might have free-tailed bats that could come all the way from as far away as Casa Grande, actually fly over Vail to forage for insects during the summer months. And so no matter where you live in Vail, you have bats flying over your house at night.
That's pretty exciting.
It is very exciting.
I know it makes me happy to know that. Some people might not be too comfortable with that, but maybe you could share a little bit about the things that bats do that really benefit the natural world.
Absolutely.
And in some regards benefit humans.
Sure. So I think the biggest benefit that we get from bats is that all of our bats, so there's 28 species, 26 of them feed primarily upon insects. And so think of things that if you're sitting outside in the summer or in the spring or even early fall, things like mosquitoes and houseflies and things like that might be active. They're feeding on them. So I think that's probably the biggest advantage for us, but they also are very important to agriculture and gardeners because many moths that are pests of crops or our gardens are fed upon by the bats as well. So by feeding on moths and biting insects, they do us a great service by not only keeping us from getting bitten, by also reducing the amount of pesticides we have to put in the environment, because pesticides end up being bad for everything, including ourselves. So the more we can limit the amount of pesticides, the better. Also, if you like agaves, if you like tequila, and who doesn't, bats are the primary pollinators of agave plants. So if you've ever had a sip of tequila, for better or worse, you can thank a bat. Even if it didn't go well, thank a bat anyway, because you wouldn't have had it if it weren't for the bats. And we have 2 species of bat, the Mexican long-tongued bat and the lesser long-nosed bat, both of which are primarily nectar feeders. And so they're going around, they're feeding on primarily agaves. They will feed on saguaro nectar, they'll feed on organ pipe nectar, those sorts of plants, but they're more attuned to the agave plants for pollination. In fact, if we didn't have bats, we wouldn't have agave plants because that's how they're pollinated. And the third thing is, I think in the last few decades, I think human attitudes towards bats have changed dramatically for the better, and I think more and more people are starting to realize that these animals are absolutely astonishing in what they can do. The smallest bat in North America is under 2 inches long, and we have it here. It's the canyon bat. It used to be called the western pipistrelle. We also, in southern Arizona, have the largest bat, and it's a little bit under 5 inches long, and it's got a wingspan of almost 2 feet. So we have the full gambit in size here right in Vail in southern Arizona. But most of them are around 2 to 2.5 inches in length, maybe a little bit bigger than that. They're a lot smaller, I think, in total length than people think they are, because I think when we see them flying around at dusk, their wings make them look bigger than they really are. They're quite small. They weigh next to nothing. Many of them weigh under an ounce. And so our attitudes have gone from they're vermin, they're rabies-infested vermin that we need to exterminate, to a much more positive outlook on bats. They're much more, we're much more fascinated. We're starting to realize all the benefits we get from them. So it's really wonderful to see those attitudes change. And I think the old adage of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, we are proving it that that's not true. We're able to change our attitudes.
That's a really good thing.
It is a very good thing.
So much great habitat in Vail, so many places that we could see bats, imagine where they live, and just think about all the many jobs that they do in nature here around Vail. Can you think of another place that we could go?
Yeah, you're right. They're all around us in Vail, but I know just a spot. So we should go there next.
Oh, good. Okay, I'll follow you.
Okay.
Hey, so what do you think, Jeff? I think we found the perfect spot.
I think we did. There's bats here. There's proof of it. So this is Cienega Creek Natural Preserve, one of the Pima County properties where bats are known to live. So this is a really good spot. It's beautiful, nice and cool down here. We were looking at the bridge. This is the bridge that the train tracks, Union Pacific train tracks cross, and the bats use it. Glad to see that they're still here.
Oh, that's great. So it has those expansion joints.
It's got the
that you were
joint, yeah,
talking
right
about.
in the middle. They go up there, and like I said, it looks like a really small little spot, but they're not very big animals, and they can wedge themselves up there. One thing that's really cool, I think, about bats, they have a very high heat tolerance. So, our attics get, in Tucson in the summer might get 125, 130 degrees. And that doesn't even phase some of the bats.
Really?
They're not even overheating at that point yet. So the fact that they can get up in this concrete structure that's getting heated up by the sun all day and would be very unpleasant for us, it doesn't even bother them.
So they just sleep right through all that heat.
Through the heat, through the trains, they have a high tolerance of nonsense.
And from what I've read, they like to get really close together.
Correct. Well, different species. So a lot of species like to get right together. Other species tend to be more dispersed. They're not necessarily in contact with each other, but still form a loose colony. Whereas other bats don't really form colonies really at all. For example, the canyon bat, which we talked about before, they don't really form colonies. They tend to be more solitary. At the other end of the spectrum, you got the Mexican freetails, which form those huge colonies, and then you have everything sort of in between. There's about 1,300 species of bat around the world, so you have 1,300 different variations on it. But most of the bats tend to, at least in North America, tend to live in groups of some size. It might be pallid bats, for example, a couple dozen, maybe to a little bit over 100, somewhere in that range, whereas again, that's a small colony compared to what other sunbats do.
Well, I'm really anxious. I've been waiting to see that evidence you said
Okay,
that you were going to show us. So let's go
look.
do that. Oh, so Jeff, this is exactly what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yes. So what we have here, this is, again, we're underneath the bridge, and these black patches, they kind of go from one end of the bridge all the way to the other end, and this is guano. So this is bat poop. You can usually tell if a bridge is occupied for a couple of different ways. You don't have to be there when the bats are emerging to know that they're there. Number one is you find the guano on the ground, or number two, you can smell them. You can smell, it's the combination of the guano. Sometimes some bats, like pallid bats, have these glands on them that can produce an odor that we can smell. And so you can sometimes smell them. If you can't smell them, you can definitely tell if they're here because they leave the guano deposits behind. I don't know how many bats are under here. It's probably not a huge number, maybe a couple thousand, based on the amount of guano that's on the ground. But you can, there's the expansion joint up there, and that's where they go. They're not just like hanging underneath. They're actually going into that crack, and that's where they'll spend the daytime. So this is a day roost. Whereas if you see a bat on your patio at night, that's kind of a night roost. And they can land anywhere to do that. That's like a digesting and grooming themselves sort of thing. But every morning or near dawn, they'll fly back and they'll fly back up into here, and that's where they'll spend the daytime. So the fact that they live under train bridges, that the fact that they live under traffic bridges, again, indicates that they have a really high tolerance for a lot of disturbance. You know, the cars going over, the trains going over, the heat. So they're actually very tolerant of that sort of stuff.
They're very adaptable.
Exactly. We have our bridge with the bats under it, and so these bats could be flying out from this bridge, and they can actually cover many, many miles.
How far can they go?
Some of these guys might go up to 50 miles from this bridge. So if you're in Vail, and Vail covers a fairly large area, bats emerging from this bridge or any other bridge locally could be flying over your backyard or front yard and eating mosquitoes and preventing you from getting bitten by one. Or getting moss, they're going to lay eggs that will turn into caterpillars that will eat up your tomato plant. So they're really this bridge, this colony, is providing could potentially provide all of Vail with services, and all we have to do is just let them be. Let them do their thing and try not to disturb too much, and they will continue to do that forever, and that's really cool. So they provide us the insect control services. Those nectar feeding bats, which are probably not under this bridge, they don't tend to use bridges as much, but they could be. They might be using, you know, crevices in the rocks or Colossal Cave or something like that. Those bats will leave from those sites and go, again, to your hummingbird feeders. Or if you have agaves in your yard when those flower, they're going to be visiting those at night. And so, you know, that's great for the agave plants because that's how they get pollinated. And we also benefit from that because we get more agave plants. And of course, there's the tequila and mezcal aspect of that. And then just the fact that these animals are so extraordinary in what they're able to do is just, again, it's just bananas. And so really all we need to do, any of us, all of us need to do is just, you know, don't spray pesticides around our yards because that's going to kill insects that these guys could feed on. Even worse is it's going to not kill insects. Some insects, they only get like a sublethal dose, and then the bats will feed on them because they're just easier to catch. And those toxins will build up in the bats, and they could reach a level where the bat dies. And so, you know, that's probably the single best thing you can do is not use pesticides around your yard. And if you do that and, you know, everything stays fine with the bridges or the rock crevices, we'll have bats forever.
That's great.
And it's awesome.
There's so many incredible connections to bats in the Vail area. I mean, Cienega Creek Preserve, Colossal Cave Mountain Park. But I have another place that I want us to see that has been home to bats at least since the 1930s and probably much earlier than that.
I've heard that.
Have you heard that?
I really want to check that out.
Okay,
So let's go.
Let's go. You know, it's really been a really great day going around and finding all of the different places that bats like to live in Vail.
It has been.
It really has. And I always tell people, you know, Mary Jane Warner, when she retired in 1973, she was our postmistress. She said, you know, Vail may be a small place to some, but to those of us that live here, it's the center of the world.
That's
and you know
right.
what? The bats feel the same way
Yes.
because they have.
They've taken over.
They have taken over.
That's awesome.
This actually inside the old post office, the bats have been here. I can document at least since the 1930s, and they've just been a part of daily life.
That is so cool. And they've been eating mosquitoes since the 1930s.
Absolutely.
That's
well,
fantastic.
the other thing that I love about pallid bats is that they like to eat scorpions and centipedes.
They do. Absolutely they do. Pallid bats are amazing. In fact, even though they have the ability to echolocate like most other bats do, they don't do it all the time. Because their ears are so good, they can hear the sound of a scorpion or a centipede or a beetle crawling around on the ground, and they'll just drop down on it and start chewing on it.
Let's go in and see if we can meet some. Where we're standing right now was the living quarters for the postmasters or postmistresses who served Vail. And the large room that we just walked through was the store and the post office and things like that.
So it's like a general store
It's like a general
post
store.
office all at once? Okay.
Yep. And in the 1970s and 80s, when the Kelly family were here and they were operating a feed store out of this building, and Patty and Chauncey had their bedrooms here.
Okay.
And they've reminisced that while other kids were watching television, they were reading books and swatting bats.
Good for them, and I would venture to guess that they may have had a much better childhood.
They might have had it. I think they had a pretty adventurous childhood.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's terrific. I mean,
but bats are, just a really important part of our community in many ways.
Correct.
And they've been a part of this building's history, and they're very important to us. At Vail Preservation Society. So even as we're working towards rehabbing this building, we have taken care not to disturb the pallid bats. It's a pallid bat population, and we know that because we've worked with Arizona Game and Fish to document what kind of bats. And we're also, as we move towards that date when we actually begin the work here, we will be bringing in an expert to relocate the bats. There's a couple other great bat things kind of associated with this little area right here. The Vail Schools has, almost since the beginning, been right across the railroad tracks. And the students like to come over here and, help the postmistress with the mail bags and things like that. And the kids would go to Colossal Cave, and so they were familiar with bats. Anyway, in the 1930s and early 40s, the kids had a baseball team. And they were called the Bats.
The Bats.
And the baseball team, there was a field cleared off by the Dillon gas station. It was at Highway 83 and what was then Vail Road. We now call it Colossal Cave Road.
Okay.
And they cleared off a field, and I'll bet those kids did it themselves in those days. They had to
Back
move
then,
the cactus and
they'd
everything.
get out there and they'd move all the rocks, and quite a lot of rocks to move, and
a lot of cactus.
Yes, but that youthful enthusiasm to create something good for them.
Yeah.
And the Vail Bats, that is perfect.
Yeah.
That's a perfect
and
name.
and they would invite teams from Tucson to come out and play.
And did they have a lot of games? Did a lot of teams come out from Tucson?
Yeah, they did.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, so it was really great.
Good. The Vail Bats.
A little bit of bat trivia. The other really interesting thing that ties bats back to this building. Otto Schley is a gentleman that built this building in 1908, but he actually was running a store here earlier. There was a building here that was the Vail store. I think going back as far as about 1888.
Wow, okay.
And it was a wooden building. So in 1905, Otto Schley, who would 2 years later build this building, he was really into mining. They call this the gig economy these days.
Right.
100 years ago, it was kind of the same thing. People did lots of things to make a living.
Right.
And Otto was operating the store, but he had lots of mining claims. He was a real entrepreneur. He was mining copper, he was mining cuprite, all kinds of things. But he discovered that there was a really large amount of guano. And it wasn't called Colossal Cave back then. It wasn't called Colossal Cave till later.
Okay.
But in the cave that we now call Colossal Cave.
Okay.
And he got some of his mining partners together, and they drilled a tunnel into what we call the Bat Cave today, and came out with 5 boxcar loads of guano.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that, like I said, that is a terrific fertilizer. I mean, it really is. And I think it's also, guano used to be used in the saltpeter as well.
Yes. So it's good to make ammunition. It's really sticky, so there's some components of it that it's used in cosmetics.
Yep.
It's like one product can do so many things.
Right.
So I think it really demonstrates the local spirit of entrepreneurship that was part of early Vail. So that portion of Colossal Cave is now protected because, of course, that was not good for the bats.
Correct, because
it was terrible.
Temperature
and
humidity.
and people, they really weren't thinking about that so much in those days. But that part of the cave is protected now.
Bats, like I said, they're fairly tolerant of a lot of things in some species, but very, very specific in others. And so, that sort of alteration might preclude all bats from coming back, or it might just preclude some of them from coming back.
Yeah, and unfortunately, because no one was doing research, we'll really never know that.
Nope, we won't.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Although we can assume if they got that much guano out, it was a pretty important cave for the bats. But in the interim, after that,
not so
they
much.
may have spread out. Who knows what happened to them?
Exactly.
This has been a great day, JJ. Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. Couple things. Bats are really cool. They provide us with ecosystem services. So try not to use pesticides around your yard. It'll keep the bats will take care of many of the insects for you. Number two is the hummingbird feeders. If you want to keep them up and as a resource for the bats, that's great. If you want to bring them in and just feed hummingbirds, it's your feeder. You can do anything you want. I personally think it's really cool to have hummingbirds coming to my feeders. And then third probably is if you find a bat on the ground or that's acting when you determine to be oddly, just don't pick it up, don't touch it. Call Game and Fish, and they'll give you instructions on how to best approach it. And then just appreciate them for the wonderful animals that they are. They're just fantastic.
Yeah, they really are, and they're so cute.
They are. They're cute as buttons.
Oh, great. Well, thanks a lot. And we're going to be heading out. And, next month, we are going to be learning about Lamar Cobb. We're going to learn about his legacy of good roads.
That's important. That's especially these days.
Well, good roads are really important. Even to bats, although the roads are different.
Yeah, the roads are up a little higher.
Yeah. But I hope you'll join us next month.
Absolutely.
We're going to be
Look forward
learning about
to it.
Lamar
Sounds
Cobb.
like fun.
Okay, great.
Thank you, JJ.
Hey, thank you.